the honor to start. So you do my best. It's a very loaded question. Even the two ways in which you ask the question have two different meanings, right? I think there is a sense in which the distinction between self and world is an empirical fact that is undeniable. So, in what sense is that the case? Well, I have some degree of control over the imagery in my imagination, but I can't change the world by just imagining it to be different. Otherwise, it would be different right now, I promise you. So there is a sense in which that distinction is undeniable. It's an empirical datum of existence. And then you can go down the question, is this, metaphysically speaking, a fundamental distinction, or is this an illusion? We can pursue those paths, but I don't think the core of the problem is whether there is a subject separate from an object. I think the core of the problem are the metaphysical assumptions we make when we talk about a subject, when we talk about a object. What do we mean by these words? To name two examples, a materialist would deny the distinction, and I would agree with the materialist there. I don't think there is any fundamental distinction between subject and object, but a materialist would make that assumption that the objects, the world out there, are exhaustively describable through quantities. In other words, if you come up with the right list of numbers, then you say everything there is to be said about the object. And then, because they don't distinguish the subject from the object, the same has to apply to the subject. So then you face that situation in which my inner life has to be exhaustively describable by a list of numbers. And I know for a fact that it isn't, because my inner life is constituted of qualities, not only quantities. Now, a panpsychist could say, well, I will make a different assumption. I will say that there are fundamental boundaries between the subjectivity inside and the objectivity outside. And I will say that those boundaries are the boundaries of the primary elements of the material world, whatever they might be. So you're basically acknowledging the distinction between object and subject at a fundamental level. But then you run into another problem because of one's metaphysical assumptions, and that is, well, if I have good reason to think I am fundamentally separate from the world out there, then by the same token, the left hemisphere of my brain is fundamentally separate from the right. Actually, by the same token, one neuron is fundamentally separate from the next neuron, one atom from the next, one subatomic particle from the next. And then you have to explain why our inner lives feel unitary, because that's how we experience it, our inner lives. So to summarize and conclude my answer, I don't think the core of the problem is the question, is the subject distinct from the object? Because there is a sense in which it obviously is, and fundamentally it probably is not. But the problem is the metaphysical assumptions we make when we talk about these things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bernardo. Reza, let's turn to you, and we'll ask the same question, which is to say, might the very distinction that we're making between subject and object, conscious experience, and the world be the mistake?
Sure. Thank you very much. I would like to bastardize this question a little bit more. I would say that I think that this whole discussion about consciousness at this point in the history of philosophy is rather misguided. Why? We look at the philosophy of mind, and philosophers of mind are giving us different perspective onto the problem of consciousness. But look like there are elements or parts, fragmented perspectives onto what you might call to be an integrated phenomenon. But precisely because they don't understand what it means to have an integrated phenomenon to begin with, a la consciousness, every perspective that they have given us so far has been distorting the problem even more. Essentially, the question of consciousness at this point in philosophy of mind has devolved into this very fact that they try to get out of the hole that they have themselves digged for so many years by digging a deeper hole for themselves. And this I would say that for me is a conceptual problem. Conceptual problem, not in a Kantian sense, but I would say in a Carnapian sense, in the Carnapian sense of conceptual engineering. I'm not talking about conceptual analysis, meaning that, look, we can actually replace the concept of consciousness with more refined concepts. No, that's not what I'm trying to say. Analyzing the concept of consciousness to kind of a subclass of family concepts. What I am basically trying to say is that we can allow more mature Carnap think about this, that the concept of consciousness is the root of the problems that we are dealing with. And these are rather pseudo problems at this point, not real problems. The way to go forward is to, a la Carnap, conceptual engineering paradigm, to replace the explicandum, namely inexact concepts, with explicatum, namely concepts which can be clarified according to the purpose which we are using them for. So conceptual engineering in that sense requires one, assessments of the current concepts and classificatory systems we are using. Two, understanding of how they are actually working with regard to the relevant concept, the relevant context of their use, and ultimately reflection upon the purpose for which we are using them for, and how we can improve that, right? So I would say that explication, namely conceptual engineering, is at this point is necessary, because it would be just, we are basically reiterating the same old stuff for the times to come. And this is the problem here.
Reza, I'm gonna stop you here for right now, and you're gonna get right back into this when we get into
absolutely.
Thank you so much. Annaka, tell us, please, from your perspective, might it be the case that the distinction between subject and object, conscious experience, and the world is itself the mistake?
I have so many questions for Reza, but I'll begin. Yes, so let me just briefly say, I guess, that I don't think that in reality, that is at a fundamental level, there is this subject-object dichotomy. I think the notion of subject comes directly out of the illusion of self, which is created by the brain. And I think the experience of self comes largely out of the function of memory, although there are many different types of brain processing at play that I think contribute to this illusion. And so I think we tend to not see conscious experiences for what they are at a very basic level, which I would say is qualia or felt experience that appear in the universe, rather than qualia that appear to a subject in the universe, which I think is an additional and false step and way of seeing things. So the combination of qualia through memory and across time creates this illusion that there's a solid self moving through time, that, again, certain conscious experiences are appearing too. But I think that's part of the illusion, and that this illusion contaminates a lot, if not most, of our thinking about consciousness. So in contemplating theories that place consciousness at a fundamental level, which is something I'm very open to and interested in, I consider it to be a red flag when I see the use of subject or the concept of subject embedded in the theory. And that if we're going to consider consciousness as fundamental, I think we need to look at qualia or felt experience more like bubbles in a pot of boiling water, where consciousness itself is pervasive. So consciousness is the water in that analogy. So I just think it's important to question how we're thinking about or using concepts like subject and self, and privacy is another term that comes up in this context. and to just keep a close eye on how we're using these concepts or how they're guiding or rather misguiding our thinking.
Great. Thank you so much. And finally, Hilary Lawson, might I ask you, might the very distinction between subject and object, conscious experience and the world, be the mistake?
Thank you. Well, it seems to me there are many layers to this puzzle, and I'd just like to begin with just a very, very simplistic historical picture, and then I'll say something about what my thoughts are. So in an overall context, subject and object has been central to Western thought since Descartes, certainly, and the question is, what's the relationship between them? And the obvious, there are three obvious explanations, one of which they're two separate things, and there's no real relationship between them. That's a dualist perspective, Cartesian perspective. There's the perspective that all is subjectivity. There is only subjectivity, and the objective world is in some sense an illusion. I think this is a position that Bernardo takes up in some form. It was very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, rather less fashionable in the 20th. And the alternative is that it's all objective. And that alternative is all objective. It's a very common view. It's a very contemporary sort of standard scientific picture of the world. And the problem within that framework, that everything is objective, is how do you account for experience? And hence the hard problem of consciousness within that perspective. But there's only a hard problem of consciousness within that materialist, scientific, realist story. There isn't a hard problem of consciousness for say, Bernardo's position, which is obviously starts off with consciousness. Now, so that's a historical framework. Now, that dominated until the 20th century, philosophically speaking. And in the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it was largely replaced in philosophical circles with the question of the relationship between language and the world, which is related, but is a different way of framing it. And it was replaced because the question of the relationship between language and the world seemed to be more prior, that the words subject and object are words in language. And if we're going to try and understand what is really going on here, we've got to have an account of how they relate to the world. And most of those people who are involved in that project imagine that there might be a theory which would link language directly to the world. We'd have an idea of how it referred to the world. Now, it's my view that project largely failed, that there hasn't been such a realist theory. And I would argue that our theories and language do not describe the world. They don't somehow reach through and point to things in reality. They are ways of holding reality. They are, as it were, language in our theories say, hold the world like this, operate like this. And if you operate like this, you might be able to achieve things that you can't achieve otherwise. But the words subject and object are just particular to this particular language. It's language English, at a particular time, at a particular culture, of a particular species, on a particular planet. And the idea that these words are somehow sort of pointing to some ultimate stuff out there seems to me to be entirely implausible. What subject and object are doing is they don't refer to some ultimate stuff out there or to some essential metaphysical characteristics. And they're not, therefore, like ultimate true descriptions. They're a way of holding the world. And of course, there are problems with the different options we've seen in these ways of holding the world. Now, the account that I've just given you in terms of language and our theories as being ways of holding, as it were, the openness of the world, what I would call closures, has an advantage, which is that it is able to give an account, and I can't possibly provide the detail of this in the remaining minute or so I've got here. It is able to give an account of how sensation and thought, and indeed experience, are a product of this process of closure, the holding of the world as something. And
okay, great. Actually, Hilary, I'm going to stop you right there so that we can head into it, because we're going to go right back to you with our first question, and this will allow us to get other folks reacting to your position, which is delightful. Okay, so let's just stop for a second. It seems to me that the four of our speakers agree that there is no fundamental reality to these terms, so that they are in some sense under question. But some of you seem to be all right using them, at least provisionally, and others seem to think that the terms are just a mess. So the question that I'd like to ask first of each of you, we'll start with Hillary, and then the rest of you will be able to jump in and speak with and to each other. The question is this: given its messiness, is the distinction between subject and object still necessary? And so then I guess the question is, we've got the distinction, we've got the language, so we might be able to separate those. But is the distinction between subject and object necessary, or could we imagine an alternative? Is it like a necessary evil, or is there something else we can use? And if so, what is that thing? Hillary, go for it, please.
Well, so I'd say I don't think there's anything necessary about that particular way of dividing up the world. As I say, language and the world would be another way of doing it. Heidegger would have described it in terms of being and Dasein. I've given you an account in terms of openness and closure. There are different ways of trying to hold what it is to be alive. And I don't think there's anything necessary about the subject-object way of describing things, but there isn't anything necessary about any one of them. The question is, what framework is going to be most effective and enable us to do things and intervene and produce solutions of the different ones that we have available? It's just one additional puzzle, though, I think, which is that maybe in the way that I've described these alternatives, they are all dualisms of a sort. And we might be tempted to imagine there's something about the character of experience. This is a Kantian point. There is something about the character of experience that in order to be experience at all, it has to be an experience of something, that it's just experience, and that dualism is somehow essential. And all I would say to that is that, well, we might think that, but let's not imagine that we've somehow hopped outside of language and we can say how things ultimately are. That somehow strains the limits of what we can say, and we're at risk of imagining that our language can become metaphysics.
Mary Jane, can I jump in, or did you want to
Please
go in a particular order?
That's great, Annaka. Please do jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that I think the illusion of self it is a true illusion. I mean, so in one sense, that word is pointing to an experience that we have that I think, in terms of all of this, in terms of the illusion of self, and also the use of terms like subject and object are obviously useful in our everyday lives. It is how the human mind moves through the world. But in terms of it being useful for talking about the more fundamental nature of reality, I mean, the truth is that even the human mind can still be conscious without an experience of self. And I think when we talk about subject, and maybe we want to get into the details here, but to me, whenever I hear someone using the word subject, it's kind of a very, very basic, kind of the most basic level or version of what our experience of self is. And so it's possible, many people who practice meditation for many years, people under the influence of psychedelic drugs can really drop this illusion of self and have a conscious experience that is not a dualistic one. Whether that is giving us correct information about fundamental nature of reality or not, I don't know, but the point is that there is clearly an illusion that takes place that can drop away. And if that illusion is informing the way we think about consciousness itself, I think that that's a problem, and there's something we need to be aware of and weed out of any description of a fundamental nature of reality. I mean, it's a place where we can see that something that we know is an illusion is actually getting into our scientific explanation of the world in a way that seems not productive to me.
Bernardo, would you hop in here on the self as illusion and the possibility of doing away with this distinction through one or another kind of experiences? Is this the right way to think about these categories?
It comes down to how we use the words, right? One could argue that there cannot be qualia, there cannot be experience without an experiencer. The qualia is to the subject who experiences, and I would even agree with that, but that doesn't mean that there is an individual experiencer, an individual subject that remains stable from birth to death and then disappears. That there I would agree completely with Annaka. Our idea of a personal, individual self is a narrative constructed with words, and it's ultimately an illusion that we end up believing in. But then if we go further than that and say, well, there is no subject, period, then a lot of people would disagree because their intuitive understanding of the subject is the experiencer. And if you grant that there is experience, then I would say this entails the existence of an experiencer.
Why?
So Galen Strawson once wrote that not even a sensible Buddhist would agree with that. I would say that the why this is so, it's what the words mean. If there is an experience, there is some entity that has the experience, that undergoes the experience. I don't think it is coherent to talk about the experience or qualia without that to which the qualia are given.
Okay, so yeah, this is definitely a fundamental disagreement. I would just say one quick thing, which is that we can talk about qualia itself as being private, qualia itself. To me, it's an additional piece to talk about some external thing that the experience is appearing to.
It's not external. I didn't say it's external. I said it's entailed by the experience. So the fact that there is experience entails that there is an experiencer.
But I don't see why. I think that is very closely tied to our human intuition, because that is so close to the experience we have. But it doesn't. You could describe a universe where an experience of blue arises, an experience of pressure arises, an experience, and those are simply experiences arising. When you say to the experientor, you're by definition adding something.
It's a linguistic implication of how we use the word.
Okay, so maybe we agree, and it's just a.
It might be. Let's let Reza jump in here for a second, to see if there's another angle that we can.
My apologies for to be the enemy of the public. I actually disagree with all of you. I think that first of all, annaka is confusing phenomenal selfhood with subjectivity, with rational subjectivity. That is the canonical sin of philosophy. If you cannot tell the difference between phenomenal selfhood, a la Metzinger, which is a really fantastic thesis, Metzinger makes sure that phenomenal selfhood is an illusion. But then going on and basically confusing this with rational subjectivity, namely rational self-consciousness, the understanding of perception, action, and inference, all together combined, unity of thoughts and action, unity of theory and practice, that's a sin. That's a philosophical sin. You are essentially doing the same thing again that I was basically warning against, confusing explicandum with explicatum. So that's one. Rational subjectivity can in fact be built on top of the very idea that selfhood, phenomenal selfhood, is an illusion. Let's agree on this. We can still have an account of rational subjectivity on top of neuroscientific accounts of the illusion of phenomenal selfhood. Number one. Then second, the idea of subject and object is not about holding the world in a certain kind of subjective way. Look, the whole idea of having a world is a transcendental question. You cannot sidestep it. Most important thing in Kant and Hegel, or the entire German idealist and 21st century, we see that to have a world is not a given. You need to have a certain kind of world involving abilities to have a world before you actually go and talk about subject and object. And to think that the world is given to you already, and or basically the division between subject and object simply boils down to the idea of me versus the world confronting me as such. That's just ridiculous. It's pre-critical philosophy par excellence.
Fabulous. All right, so Hillary, let's loop back around to you. Let's make sure that Hillary, you get to answer the question. Is there something more fundamental than holding and closure? And Annaka, I'd like also right afterwards you to respond to the question about, are you confused about the nature of selfhood and the subject? Hillary, go for it.
I just say, I feel I've fallen back in this conversation into the 18th and 19th centuries. We've somehow forgotten the linguistic term. I don't think we can argue over the metaphysics as if our words are simply pointing to a reality out there, as if the answer might be there is only the subject, or there is only the object, or that some panpsychist solution might be outcome. All of those are trying to reach beyond language to say what the essential nature of the world is like. And I don't think we can do that. What we can do instead is offer models of the world, which I would call closures. You can offer a model of the world and say, operate like this. And then we can explore the value and strengths of these different models. And there are values of a purely objective frame. It's a very effective frame for much of science. There are values of the subjective account as well. It's very important in a legalistic context. You know, how do we assign blame? How do we assign responsibility? And getting rid of the subject is fundamentally problematic in those areas. And I don't think we have, as in a sense, to choose between us as if one of them is right. That's not what language is. It's not like it's true or false. It's a way of intervening in the world. And we've got to judge between these different accounts which ones enable us to intervene better, and can, of course, we're always trying to build a bigger closure, as it were. Can we somehow make them simpler and get rid of these different oppositions? So I'd like to get away from the idea that any one of us round this metaphorical table is going to provide the right answer. What we're offering is different ways of holding what it is to be human.
Annaka, could you talk briefly about the distinction between the phenomenological self and the subject of consciousness?
Yeah, well, first I just want to reiterate that I think there are different, excuse me, there are different levels of conversation. So I think it's extremely valuable for human psychology, excuse me, for our court systems, for, you know, all kinds of everyday life. That is not an area where I would suggest that we lose the notion of self or subject. But in terms of the work that I'm focused on, and in terms of my interest in interpretations of quantum mechanics and whether there is a place for consciousness at a more fundamental level, and in terms of what our experience actually is, you know, I would say the same thing back to Reza, which is that, and that is my initial point, is that I think most people are confused, and that for most people, unless they've had the experience of seeing through the illusion of self, it's almost an impossible thing to imagine. It's such a strong illusion that even I, after many years of practicing meditation and many experiences of being in a state of not feeling that I am an experiencer, or that there is an experiencer, and the conclusion that I've come to that truly is an additional additional step that gets put in that is almost impossible to not place there unless this illusion of self has been broken through. But my issue is that because not only can I see it for myself, but the neuroscience really backs this up. And I think the further along neuroscience gets, the more we'll be faced with this reality. And it's part of the reason why I think it's important for us to talk about, because I do think that many people not only find it counterintuitive, they find it destabilizing to think in these terms. And I think, one, it's important for us to be kind of psychologically prepared for what we are going to discover about the nature of the human mind and just the nature of our own, human consciousness, separate from what's going on at the fundamental level. But I also actually think this kind of moves on to a separate point, but that it actually is ultimately psychologically incredibly positive and transformative to see through this illusion and to notice that the existence of an observer or a subject is in fact an addition, even to our own human experience.
Great. So this takes us exactly where we need to go next, which is to say, and Reza, we're going to head to you first for this second question, the second prompt, which is precisely the question of neuroscientific developments in AI, which is to say, are current advancements and current developments in these fields, in AI, in neuroscience, going to help us understand better whatever it is we are trying to understand when we have traditionally used these terms of subject and object? Is it going to get to something like what Annaka is talking about with meditative experience, or is it heading in a different direction? Reza, from your perspective, what's going on?
Right. Okay. I would say that I try to be the most cynical person on the block, but I actually would say in this very case that yes, I think that this research. Forms of research or modes of research are going to help us. This is an outside view of what it means to be human. What is AI other than an outside view of what it means to be human, or AGI for that matter, artificial general intelligence? But that usually is being understood, Bernardo knows this, that in certain kind of circle, singularity cult and stuff, is being misinterpreted. But for us engineers and philosophers, for us, this is a very specific sort of problem. Look, obviously, my way of thinking about this, I think of consciousness, as I mentioned, as an explicandum. Once we explicate it, we can understand it as a complex system, as an integrated information processing of the broadest possible sense, right? Multi-level, multi-scale, nested hierarchies, so on and so forth. Really a complex system. So how are we going to actually talk about this phenomenon? Obviously, we are not going, we can't use the ordinary, basically trivial vocabularies that philosophy of mind has been using it for the past 50, 60 years. We have to use the vocabularies of contemporary neuroscience, theoretical computer science, and of course, philosophy and biology and so on and so forth. Right. My idea is simple as that. I think that consciousness is a matter of functional integration. Essentially, what we are dealing with is a phenomenon that is only a phenomenon by virtue of integrating completely different functions at different levels, interlevels and intralevels. And hence, basically, what we are talking about is understanding what integration of different faculties, a la Kant, means. For something to be a subject, a rational subject, to be an agent, to have certain kind of world-involving capacities.